Hey everyone, welcome back to the deep dive.
Mm.
Sometimes the news cycle feels like trying to drink from a fire hose, right? It's just hard to make sense of what's truly important. Today we're going to help you unpack one of the most urgent and frankly kind of mind-boggling situations unfolding right now. That's the escalating direct conflict between Israel and Iran. We've been sifting through a massive stack of sources for you, everything from recent reports, AP News, CNN, CTV News, NPR, plus some really deep analyses from places like the Institute for the Study of War and the Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Right. And our mission here for you listening is really to cut through all that noise, that information overload. We want to distill it down to what you really need to know. So, the crucial events. Yeah. The motivations behind these pretty dramatic actions and the really significant implications, not just for the region, but maybe far beyond. We'll explore these strategic shifts, the why behind the headlines, and maybe highlight some surprising facts you might have missed along the way.
Exactly. Our goal is simple. Leave you feeling genuinely well-informed, but not buried under a mountain of data. So, okay, let's unpack this. Let's dive in. This isn't just another skirmish, is it? It really feels like a turning point. To really get the gravity of this, we have to go back a bit to June 2025. There was a series of events that just completely reshaped things. What kicked off this new direct phase?
It really began with what Israel called Operation Rising Lion. This was a surprise wave of airstrikes on June 12th, and what made this stand out was the sheer scale and the audacity, frankly. Israel used over 100 aircraft. We're talking F-35 Lightning II stealth fighters. These are, top-of-the-line jets, hard to detect, plus F-15s, F-16s. And get this, reports say they even smuggled drones deep inside Iran, and some Israeli warplanes actually breach Iranian airspace.
Whoa, breaching Iranian airspace.
Right.
That's a huge step, a real escalation. So what were they hitting? What were the targets?
Hugely strategic targets, really aimed at hitting Iran's capabilities and, importantly, its leadership. On the nuclear front, they struck the main enrichment facility at Natanz. Black smoke was seen rising there. Also, a smaller facility in Fordo, explosions reported nearby. And they even targeted the, quote, inactive Arak heavy water reactor. Specifically, its core seal, seems like, to stop any potential plutonium production down the line. But it wasn't just nuclear. They had a wide range of military stuff, too. Missile production sites, drone factories, and Iran's air defense network. And that notably included S-300 systems, the advanced Russian missile defense systems. Taking those out is a big deal.
So it's like they were trying to dismantle not just the nuclear potential, but the whole defensive and offensive capability. Going right for the heart of it, that's a massive strategic gamble, isn't it?
Absolutely, a huge gamble. And it gets even more direct than that. This wasn't just about blowing up buildings. Israel explicitly targeted Iranian leadership figures. I mean, Iranian media confirmed the deaths of several really high-ranking officials. Major General Mohammad Bagheri, he was the chief of the Armed Forces General Staff. Major General Hossein Salami, the IRGC commander. Gholam Ali Rasid, another top commander. They also killed nuclear scientists Faridun Abbasi and Mohammad Mehdi Tehranchi. And Ali Shamkhani, a top advisor to the supreme leader, he was targeted too, reportedly in critical condition.
Wow. Targeting specific leaders like that, military, scientific, that's incredibly aggressive. It feels like a real shift from the old shadow war tactics. The big question after a strike that massive is always, okay, what's the response? And Iran's answer came fast, didn't it? And it was big.
Oh, yeah. Swift and large scale. Late Friday, early Saturday, so June 13th, 14th, Iran fired. Yeah, the numbers are staggering. Over 100 drones, 450 missiles, and maybe up to 1,000 drones in total. That's according to Israeli army estimates. An unprecedented volume of direct fire at Israel.
Good grief. What kind of impact did that have on the ground in Israel?
It was significant. You had air raid sirens just going off constantly. Jerusalem, Tel Aviv, across the country. In Tel Aviv itself, missiles hit a high-rise apartment building. Our spots, too. 7 people wounded in one barrage, mostly light injuries, thankfully. But in Rishon LeZion, tragically, an Iranian missile struck near homes. It killed 2 people, injured 19 others, and severely damaged 4 houses. And then in Beersheba, the Soroka Medical Center, that's the biggest hospital in southern Israel, was hit, damaged its old surgical wing. Luckily, they'd evacuated it beforehand as a precaution, but still, several people were treated for minor injuries and shock.
So a hospital got hit. What was Iran's explanation for that?
Well, Iranian state media claimed the missile was actually aimed at a military target nearby. They denied intentionally hitting the hospital, but, hitting a hospital, it raises serious questions.
Regardless of intent, the result is devastating. Overall, those Iranian strikes killed at least 24 people in Israel, hundreds wounded. And if we look at the total human cost here across both sides, it's just awful. That Washington-based human rights group reported at least 639 people killed in Iran, including 263 civilians and over 1,300 wounded from the Israeli strikes. What do these numbers tell us?
They just underscore the incredibly high stakes, don't they? And the immense human tragedy of this kind of direct confrontation. It's clearly not just about strategic facilities anymore. Civilians are right in the thick of it, caught in the crossfire. And
Yeah.
the scale of these attacks means the human cost is tragically immediate. Very real. Okay, so let's pivot to Israel's thinking. What was their rationale for Operation Rising Lion?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu stated it very clearly publicly. He said Iran's nuclear capabilities are a clear and present danger to Israel's survival. Full stop. He said he launched the operation to roll back the Iranian threat, and he vowed to eliminate both the nuclear and the ballistic missile threats. Pretty ambitious goals. Yeah, very ambitious. But analysts suggested there was more to it than just the nukes, right? What else were they maybe trying to achieve?
That's right. It seems the campaign beyond the nuclear program was really focused on systematically taking apart Iran's conventional military power. Their air defenses, their missile forces. There also seemed to be an aim to degrade Iran's economy, make it harder for them to rebuild militarily, and definitely trying to restore deterrence, especially after the shock of the October 7th Hamas attacks in 2023. And maybe, just maybe in the longer view, some hope to destabilize or even displace the Iranian regime itself, though that's a very tall order.
Okay, so a multi-layered strategy, and Israel certainly played up its successes as operational wins. How do those claims stack up? Do they really set Iran back significantly?
Well, according to Israeli and some U.S. assessments, yeah, they reported significant initial successes. They claimed the strikes severely crippled Iran's missile production. One U.S. assessment estimated it could take at least a year for Iran to rebuild that capability. A year. Also, most of Iran's air defense network, including nearly all those advanced S-300 systems, reportedly destroyed. Now, from Israel's point of view, that basically clears the skies for potential future strikes, right? Makes it much easier. And they claimed Iran's ability to launch those big missile barrages was significantly degraded.
Okay, that's a pretty comprehensive list of claimed damage to conventional forces. What about the nuclear program itself?
On the nuclear front, the claim was that the strikes set back the program by a few months. They hit centrifuge plants, both at Natanz and the Tehran Research Center. Labs involved in converting uranium gas to metal were hit, buildings holding advanced centrifuge parts. But maybe one of the most surprising things, or perhaps revealing, was the reported level of intelligence penetration. They apparently had superb intelligence penetration of both Iran and Hezbollah. That's how they could identify and track key leaders, and even, as we mentioned, smuggle drones deep into Iran for some of these strikes. That's incredible TTPs.
That level of intelligence is wow. And
Yeah.
the rhetoric coming out of Israel was extremely strong, too.
Extremely. Netanyahu said Israel harmed the nuclear program very strongly and basically put everyone on notice, saying no one is immune, even Supreme Leader Khamenei. And Defense Minister Israel Katz was even more explicit, saying Khamenei can no longer be allowed to exist. I mean, that's language you don't usually hear, even in this conflict.
Can no longer be allowed to exist. That's...
Yeah.
Yeah, that's incredibly provocative. Okay, let's shift focus. How did Iran react publicly? What's their official posture, and what's happening inside the country?
Well, Iran's official line, voiced by Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, is that their actions are purely self-defense. He said Iran has no limits in defending its interests and people. Strong words. But he also added that Iran remains committed to diplomacy. So a bit of a mixed message there, defiance, but maybe leaving a door open. They continue to insist, of course, that their nuclear program is peaceful, and they lodged a complaint with the IAEA, the UN nuclear watchdog, accusing Israel of state terrorism and violating international law by attacking nuclear facilities. And their deputy foreign minister, Majid Takht Ravanchi, issued a pretty stark warning to the U.S. He basically said if the U.S. gets involved militarily, Iran will retaliate wherever necessary, framing it as self-defense.
No limits in defending its interests. That's a really bold statement. What's the signal there? And what are the risks if they follow through?
It's clearly meant to signal resolve, right? To deter further attacks from Israel or the U.S. But the huge risk, obviously, is widening the conflict dramatically. It could pull in other actors, spiral out of control. Internally, the impact of the Israeli strike sounds pretty severe. There were reports of nationwide internet restrictions, almost a complete blackout at times, and the government apparently threatened really harsh prison sentences, like up to 10 years, for any civilians caught providing evidence of the airstrikes to what they called hostile media, trying to control the narrative, clearly.
Wow. And what about daily life for ordinary people, especially in Tehran?
Witnesses described a constant sound of bombing, making it hard to sleep. Lots of residents apparently fled the city, leading to this quote that stuck with me. An eerie feel of a post-apocalyptic movie.
Gosh, eerie feel of a post-apocalyptic movie. That
Yeah.
really paints a picture. It brings home the human reality of this beyond the strategic chess game, doesn't it?
It really does. And public sentiment seems complex. On one hand, you hear criticisms of the regime, dissatisfaction, but there's also reports of a strong sense of hatred toward Netanyahu specifically, and maybe a bit of a rally around the flag effect too, people posting nationalist videos online. Meanwhile, the head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, Mohammad Eslami, claimed the nuclear facilities are doing fine, despite the reports of damage. But the international concerns about that nuclear program, they remain incredibly high. Iran is still the only non-nuclear weapon state enriching uranium up to 60%.
And 60% is really close to weapons grade, right?
Yeah.
Like technically very close.
Exactly. It's considered just a short technical step away from the 90% needed for a bomb. Think of it like having almost all the ingredients ready. Plus, the IAEA, the watchdog, has censured Iran for not cooperating fully. They've said they lost continuity of knowledge about Iran's heavy water production because of restrictions Iran imposed, which basically means the IAEA can't fully track all the nuclear material or activities over time. That severely undermines their ability to verify that everything is peaceful. And remember, the IAEA also reported finding evidence related to possible nuclear weapons activity at Parchin way back in 2016. So the history there is complex.
And other countries are worried too.
Yeah, notably Russia. Their foreign ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, publicly questioned the whole idea of striking nuclear facilities. She pointed out the huge risk of radioactive fallout, a very serious concern.
A critical warning from Russia there. So in this incredibly volatile mix, you have the United States, always a key player. What does this all mean for President Trump and his administration? Where do they stand?
It's a huge dilemma for them. President Trump's position seems to have, well, evolved a bit. Initially, the White House played down any U.S. involvement. The line was, "We are not involved in strikes against Iran." Simple as that. But later, Trump himself claimed he knew about the operation beforehand, and he even indicated U.S. weapons were used.
So a bit of a shift there.
Yeah. And his main goal, a core promise of his presidency, has always been to avoid getting bogged down in another long foreign war. That's his primary imperative. However, he's also reportedly listening to arguments, including from Israel, that maybe only the U.S. has the power to definitively stop Iran's nuclear ambitions for good.
That creates a real tension, doesn't it? Avoid war, but maybe feel pressure to intervene decisively. His public statements seem to reflect that too.
Absolutely. They've been all over the map, frankly. On one hand, demanding Iran's unconditional surrender, very strong language, but then also saying things like, "I may do it, I may not do it, nobody knows what I'm going to do." He clearly believes Iran is super close, maybe a few weeks away from a nuclear weapon, but crucially, he also signaled he'd make a decision on direct U.S. military involvement within 2 weeks. And significantly, he seemed to suggest an openness to diplomacy in that same time frame, so maybe keeping options open.
Interesting. Now, within that decision-making, there's this critical military challenge, the Fordo nuclear facility.
Yeah.
Why is that specific site such a big deal, such a problem?
Fordo is unique because it's buried so deep under a mountain. The estimate is around 260 feet below the surface.
260 feet. That's like a 20-story building underground.
Exactly. It makes it almost impossible to destroy with conventional bombs. To really take it out, Israel or anyone would likely need advanced U.S. weaponry. Specifically, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the MOP. It's basically a 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb. Huge, designed precisely for these deeply buried, hardened targets. And only U.S. bombers, the B-52 or the B-2 stealth bomber, can carry and drop it. Fordo is so deep it might even need 2 MOPs to guarantee destruction.
So access to that U.S. weapon is key.
It likely is. And adding another layer, U.S. officials had apparently cautioned Israel against attacking Fordo earlier, precisely because they didn't want to disrupt ongoing nuclear negotiations with Iran.
So it's not just a military nut to crack, it's politically sensitive too. With tensions this high, what other moves is the U.S. making on the ground?
Well, they've started evacuating some non-essential diplomats from the embassy in Israel. They've also offered voluntary evacuations for families of U.S. troops stationed across the wider Middle East, precautionary measures. And military resources are being shifted around in the region. It looks like preparations for potential contingencies, whatever those might be. Back in Washington, politically, senior Senate Democrats are really emphasizing the need for Congress to be involved in any decision for military action. They want a clear plan, goals, risks, costs, timeline. And they're reminding everyone that Congress has not authorized military action against Iran. So there's pushback brewing there.
Right, the constitutional role of Congress. And what about the American public? How are they feeling about Israel's strikes?
It's pretty divided, actually. A recent Fox News poll showed voters split almost down the middle. 49% approve of Israel's strikes, 46% disapprove. But interestingly, a clear majority, 59%, believe the strikes actually make the world more dangerous. So there seems to be a real public wariness about escalating things further.
Okay, let's widen the lens again. How is the rest of the world reacting? Is there any kind of unified global response, or is it more fractured?
Largely, the international community has condemned the Israeli attacks and is calling for de-escalation. That's the main theme. Pretty much all the regional countries, Bahrain, Egypt, Iraq, Jordan, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Turkey, the UAE, they all put out statements condemning the attacks, urging calm, emphasizing international law and sovereignty. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, expressed deep alarm, urged maximum restraint, pushed for diplomacy. And the UN Security Council held an emergency meeting because Iran requested it. Russia, which is obviously allied with Iran, saw President Putin offer to mediate. He said he shared Moscow's proposals with Iran, Israel, and the US. And interestingly, Putin apparently got an agreement from Israel to ensure the safety of over 200 Russian engineers who are working at Iran's Bushehr nuclear power plant.
That's a specific detail, shows those back channels are working on some level.
Seems so. Russia also explicitly warned the U.S. against giving direct military aid to Israel for strikes on Iran, saying it would cause radical destabilization.
Okay, what about the major European powers? Germany,
Yeah.
France, the UK.
Mostly, they echoed the calls for restraint, for a return to diplomacy, standard diplomatic language. However, there was this quite surprising quote from the German Chancellor, Friedrich Merz. He called Israel's actions the dirty work Israel is doing for all of us, and expressed respect for their courage.
Wow, dirty work for all of us. That's a very different tone. It suggests some underlying alignment, maybe.
It definitely highlights a more complex, perhaps less public sentiment among some Western allies. It wasn't the standard diplomatic line, that's for sure. And meanwhile, countries like Australia and India have started helping their citizens evacuate the region, which just shows the broader impact, right? Affects international travel, safety concerns are rising globally.
Okay, so when we step back and analyze these huge regional shifts, the consensus seems to be this is the most dangerous situation the region has experienced so far. What are the big long-term implications people are talking about, especially for Iran's nuclear program?
That really is the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it? Though Israel clearly showed impressive capabilities, especially in clandestine operations and intelligence gathering. That seems undeniable. But the long-term impact on Iran's nuclear program, that's heavily debated. Some analysts think, yeah, it's a setback, but Iran could probably reconstitute its program within a year or two, maybe even shift key parts to secret, unknown locations. And if that happens, well, it might necessitate repeated attacks by Israel or others, which just sets up this potentially endless, dangerous cycle of escalation if you can't find a diplomatic off-ramp. But something else really remarkable seems to be happening here, too. The so-called axis of resistance.
Iran's network of proxy groups, right? Hezbollah, Hamas, the Houthis.
Exactly. Their way of projecting power across the region without necessarily getting their own hands dirty directly. That network seems to have been significantly weakened. Hezbollah in Lebanon, in particular, seems constrained. There was the revived Lebanese state push, plus their senior leadership took huge hits back in 2024. So what this suggests is maybe a major shift away from that proxy warfare model towards more direct state-on-state conflict between Israel and Iran. That's a fundamental change in how things operate in the Middle East.
So we're moving from a shadow war fought indirectly through proxies to basically a direct punch-for-punch fight between the main players. That completely changes the rules of deterrence, doesn't it? And what about ripple effects, the economic ones?
It absolutely redefines regional power dynamics and deterrence, yeah. Economically, we saw it immediately. Those Israeli strikes hit an oil refinery, natural gas facilities in Iran. Global oil prices, Brent crude specifically, jumped 7% almost right away. And now there are serious concerns about Iran potentially disrupting shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. Remember, something like 20% of all global oil shipments pass through there. Any disruption could send energy markets into chaos. And some analysis goes even further. suggesting these strikes, while one analysis said they could ultimately prove to be the final nail in the Islamic Republic's coffin.
Well, final nail in the coffin. That's incredibly strong language.
Yeah.
Is there really a basis for thinking it could destabilize the regime to that extent?
It's definitely a bold claim, yeah.
Right.
But it ties back to that domestic dissatisfaction we talked about earlier, the protests, the slogans like, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran. This conflict, this direct hit on Iran, could certainly exacerbate those internal pressures, maybe lead to internal power struggles, or at least inflict what some call permanent damage on the regime's standing and capability. It highlights those internal fissures.
Okay, so just to recap where we are, we've seen this incredibly rapid escalation from a long simmering shadow war into direct, open conflict. Major strikes on both sides. Israel pursuing really bold, maybe surprising objectives, hitting leadership, aiming to cripple capabilities, Iran hitting back hard, maintaining a defiant public stance despite facing severe internal challenges and damage. And caught in the middle, or perhaps on the edge, is the United States, facing this precarious choice about intervention, with President Trump's unpredictable statements, military constraints like Fordo, and a divided public at home.
Yeah, I think this deep dive really just underscores the incredible complexity, doesn't it? How interconnected everything is in that region. It shows how military actions, even ones that seem targeted, have these massive, far-reaching consequences, political, economic, social, that just ripple outwards across the globe. It really hammers home why critical thinking, trying to understand all these different angles, is just so essential when you're trying to process this kind of overwhelming information.
Absolutely. And that brings us to a final thought for you, our listener, to chew on. With this axis of resistance, Iran's proxy network, seemingly faltering and direct confrontation now the reality,
Yeah.
how does this redefine the very idea of deterrence in the Middle East going forward? What does a future without proxies really look like in that region? Something to think about. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive today.